Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
I don't know if you heard, but she's coming to Canada. And hopefully, we're ready for it.
$282 million. That's the estimated economic impact that Taylor Swift will have on Toronto when her blockbuster Eras Tour makes its stop here next month.
The music world's biggest tour ever has gone to Paris and Florida. By now, it's said so long London. And 2 weeks from today, it will cross the lakes and land in Toronto. And we should know all too well by now, as this tour has been rolling for more than 100 shows in a year and a half. But when Taylor Swift lands in your city, you wake up and everything has changed.
I want to encourage residents and visitors to plan ahead and, if possible, take public transit, rideshare, or bike share to and from the concert rather than driving. We want to make sure that everyone arrives with plenty of time to get into the stadium, find their spot, swap friendship bracelets, and do that well before the show begins.
That's Toronto's General Manager of Transportation, explaining how the city will attempt to keep tens of thousands of Swifties safe and sound from the very first night until it's time to go. And beyond what happens in Toronto or in Vancouver, where Swift will perform the Eras Tour for the last time, it's worth asking the one big question. Just how did this happen? I mean, you can call it what you want. A collective phenomenon, an epiphany, a love story, it doesn't matter. The end game here is this. Bigger than the Beatles had always been a metaphor, something from every young artist's wildest dreams. But it's not fantasy anymore for her. So like I said, how? Well, we've got an interesting guest today, and I think he knows. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Rob Sheffield is an American music journalist and the author of Heartbreak is the National Anthem, How Taylor Swift Reinvented Pop Music. Good time for a book on Taylor. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Why don't we start with this? Because I'm speaking to you from Toronto, where we're just a couple weeks away from the Eras Tour, coming here for 6 nights. After that, I believe she's going to Vancouver for a number of nights. When the Eras Tour rolls into a city like Toronto, what do we know about what that means economically for wherever she's landing on a given night?
It means that that city, whatever it might be, the other 364 days of the year, it means that that city is the epicenter of the Taylor universe. And it transforms economies. It turns the entire town into a town that is crawling with people who've traveled to the show from all over the world. And it's an exciting thing to happen to any city.
Do we have any figures that can tell us sort of, it's worth X millions of dollars for the city? I know the city likes to obviously tout that it's going to be an economic windfall for them, but I guess I'm just trying to quantify that.
Different cities give different figures, but for New Orleans and Miami, the last couple of weekends, it was north of 100 million.
Wow. And that is just for, I guess, a few shows? I know 6 is a lot, right?
6 is a lot, yes. Those were just 3 apiece, and they brought that kind of juice into the economy just because this is unlike anything else in pop culture right now or ever. There's never been a tour quite like this one with the sustained mania of it.
And what kind of security measures are we talking about here? I know that there was at the very least a serious threat in one city and maybe others. How tight is this tour locked down?
Yeah, well, there were these shows in Vienna last summer that were canceled because of a threat. That's the only one that's been canceled because there was a terrorist threat. The security is generally really mellow. Obviously, Swifties are not people who are out there trashing windshields or, looting grocery stores. They tend to be music fans, and it's not really a rowdy or druggy or violent scene, to say the least.
Right.
In terms of security, the main issue seems to be people crowding outside the stadium hearing shows in the parking lot. And some cities have had to actually restrict the cars going into the parking lot to people who actually do have tickets, because a lot of people just show up just to listen outside the venue and sing along. Like on those old Neil Diamond live albums where there'd be people up in the trees outside the arena and he'd say, "Bless you, tree people, I'm singing to you too." And that's very much the phenomenon at a Taylor Swift show. My sister went to a few of the shows in Boston, just dropping them off and just staying in the parking lot and, dancing and listening with the other moms.
You mentioned that there's never really been anything before quite like this tour. Can you give us a sense of why that is and how it compares to previous or contemporary world tours, even by huge bands? And, here we're probably talking about like the Beatles and the Stones and Springsteen or U2. I'm not sure, but I mean, you're kind of the music historian. Where does this stack up and what's different about it?
All those bands have done really in-demand, high-profile, legendary tours. But for Swift to do this at this time, honestly, nobody could have predicted the phenomenon that this tour became, not even her. It was a thing where she hadn't toured in quite a few years. The last tour that she'd done was in 2018 for the Reputation tour, which was awesome. It had all these inflatable snakes and everything. It had a really great bombastic set of new tunes. It was just a phenomenal tour. I loved that one. And after that, she was planning to just do a couple of shows in 2019, her Loverfest, but those shows didn't happen because of the pandemic. They were scheduled for the summer of 2020, and they simply did not happen because of the pandemic. And so she hadn't toured when she began the Eras tour. This was 5 years after her previous tour. She'd released 4 albums in that time, and nobody knew how she was going to cram all these new songs into one set. So she just decided to do the Eras tour, where she's doing parts of all the different albums and eras of her career and just making it a super long show. So it's unprecedented. There's never been something quite like this.
What about the scale of it in terms of how long it's lasted, how many fans, and, just for myself, seeing an artist able to do like 6 nights in a row in the biggest stadium in the country is pretty impressive. But how does that compare to what other artists can do or have done?
Well, it's very similar to a Springsteen tour, very similar to a Springsteen show, to tell the truth, in terms of that connection she makes with the crowd and also with the sort of fanaticism with which people attend the shows, but also with the marathon nature of the show. I mean, Taylor and Springsteen are the only people I've seen lately doing 4-hour shows. It's, and The Cure, I guess. But that level of fanaticism, at the first time I saw Taylor Swift, it really did remind me of seeing Springsteen, except if Springsteen was a teenage girl. And it very much had that sort of energy. So for all these artists that you mentioned, the Beatles, of course, had lots of whirlwind tours. They didn't, park 6 nights in one city. They were going all over the globe. It really frazzled them out. The Beatles quit touring 4 years into their career as a band. It just wasn't doing it for them anymore. It was taking energy away from the recording studio where they wanted to be. And yet Taylor has this appetite for touring that's not like these other artists that you've mentioned. I mean, U2 have done legendary tours. The Stones have done legendary tours. And yet this is just on a more colossal scale.
I also got to ask you, again, as somebody who's watched Springsteen do it for 4 hours or other artists, what about the actual athleticism on display? I haven't been to one of these shows. I've seen the Eras Tour film that came out. Like, she's not standing there with the guitar. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. It is really incredible to see just how much energy she puts into the show. Just the sheer, for me, just standing in the audience after 4 hours of the Eras Tour, most of us in the audience are ready to be carried out on a stretcher, quite frankly. There's this moment that I love during the show where she does All Too Well, 10-minute version. It's this epic. It's her most beloved song. It's the one that everybody is experiencing this mass catharsis to. And by the time it's over, everybody is worn out, ready to collapse on the floor. And it's only halfway through the show. She's still got another hour and a half to go at that point. And I don't know how she does it, especially since she puts in all these things in the show that really nobody's asking her to do. If she just wanted to stand there with a guitar, she could absolutely do that. But she does the dancing. There's this part where she does this dive into a pool at the end of the stage. And that's something that really only half the stadium can get a clear view of it. That's also something that is such a tiny moment in the show. It's only a few seconds, and yet such an incredible feat of Olympic-level athletic stamina. And it's already a couple hours into the show, and I watch that every time I've seen the Eras Tour. I watch that moment, and I think, Taylor, why are you working so much harder than you have to? It's unreal. It's very much like Springsteen. Again, a Springsteen show is another show where if I see 4 hours of it and, I'm ready to go home in a wheelchair.
I want to ask you now about sort of the broader thesis of your new book. And this is coming from a standpoint of, a non-Swiftie or a casual Swiftie at best. And for everybody else who's kind of not been involved with it, but has looked at this phenomenon, how did it happen? Like, how did she go from, a genuine big country pop artist, like certainly somebody who was a force in music, to whatever this has become? Like, was there a tipping point where that exploded? Like, what happened here? I guess I'm asking you.
It's crazy. It just built. It's funny that her debut album, which came out in 2006, just called Taylor Swift, straight up country album, but it was so shocking at the time that people heard it and she wrote all the songs. That's just not something that happened in country music at the time. It was just country singers just did not and were not expected to write their own songs. It was seen as kind of selfish. And she was doing this and she was 16. And for a lot of people, this made them dismiss her as a novelty artist, as just a fluke. And yet she's just kept building on that and building her audience as she goes. There wasn't a moment where she exploded into being Taylor Swift, but Fearless was certainly a coronation when she made her second album, won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Certainly for a lot of people, they thought that was as far as she can go, and yet she was just getting started. And one of the weird things about Taylor Swift is that you keep wondering, have we reached the peak this time? She couldn't get any more famous than this, could she? Mm-hmm. And of course, she gets more famous. Certainly 4 years ago, you would think Taylor Swift would have reached pretty much peak Taylor Swift saturation in our culture. But that looks like nothing compared to right now.
How has her music evolved over this time? And again, as somebody who is a casual listener of her music, this is kind of the thing that most fascinates me about her. And I think the first time I noticed it was her 2 pandemic albums, which were like all of a sudden, almost indie folk storytelling. But I mean, she's got other albums in all sorts of other different genres. Where does that come from in her, and why is she like this, for lack of a better term?
That's a very good question. Honestly, why is she like this is in so many ways the fundamental question of listening to Taylor Swift. She doesn't have to do it this way. When she made Red, which was her 4th album, and that was when she was 23 years old when she made that album, and that came out in 2012. And that album was just a perfect summary of everything she'd tried to do up to that point. And it was perfect, mellow, soft rock kind of record. It was also a bit country. It was a bit pop. I thought, this is the ultimate Taylor Swift album. This is the formula that she's been building toward all this time. And she could just keep making this album for the rest of her career. And of course, she hasn't made that one since. The next album she made was 1989, which was this totally synth pop record that sounded like the Pet Shop Boys. It sounded like Erasure. It sounded like Depeche Mode. It did not sound anything like Taylor Swift had done before. I remember listening to it for the first time and thinking, there's no banjo, there's no steel guitar. why is she doing this? She's completely turning her back on everything that she spent all these years building. But she's that kind of artist. She's like a Bowie or a Prince or a Neil Young who is just always going to reject the obvious successes and go somewhere new next time. So she went from being straight up country star to making this mature adult country rock pop hybrid. Then she went into synth pop. Then she went into Reputation, which is really kind of an industrial album. I know that's one that's near and dear to your heart. But that's her most...
That's my daughter's favorite album. She's dressed up today as Halloween as Reputation era Taylor Swift. And as you might imagine, this is how a 40-something-year-old man becomes a Swiftie.
That's usually the gay way. And, after that, as you said, she did the acoustic indie folk albums. She goes with these different musical passions that consume her, and it makes it impossible to guess her next move. I've been writing about her in Rolling Stone magazine since she began. So I've been covering Taylor Swift for 18 years at this point. You'd think by now I would have learned better than to try to predict where she might go next. And yet I'm always guessing and I'm always wrong. I've always been wrong. She always outfoxes the foxes in that sense. She is always a step ahead of where anybody expects her to be.
When you mention how her albums kind of surprise people, and I think there's a moment for lots of people who come to her where you're like, oh, she's not just this or she's not just that. What are the songs that she has done that have convinced you, again, as a longtime music journalist, that she hangs with the best of the best on a level of, and I'm not talking about the cultural phenomenon, we'll probably talk about that a little bit more, but in terms of pure musicianship, song crafting, etc.?
Yeah, that's the Taylor I'm most interested in. The business aspect is, kind of interesting, and the cultural phenomenon is definitely interesting, but it's the musical Taylor Swift, strictly as a songwriter and singer, where she's made her mark on history. And you could tell from her early records that she was somebody who had studied all the greats. You could tell that she was somebody who had listened to how Springsteen wrote a song, to how Carole King wrote a song, to how all the great country songwriters did it, all the great soul songwriters. You could tell that this was somebody who had studied the greats and knew how to put a song together. And to me, that was clear in her first hit, the first one I ever heard, Our Song, which is the one that goes, our song is a slamming screen door. Such a brilliant hook for a chorus. And I love the structure of it. This is a teenage girl singing, yes, I've listened to every record ever made. I've listened to the radio. I've heard all the albums. But none of those songs really do justice to how I feel. And so I'm just going to have to write a song for myself. And I just love how it ends that way. The last line of the song. And so I sat down with, pen and paper and guitar and I wrote Our Song. And for me, that was the song that announced right off that she was aiming at the level of the all-time greats. And as far as I'm concerned, she got there on her second album with a song like White Horse, which is a phenomenal country song. But it was really on Red, her fourth album, where she was writing songs that just made it clear she was on the level of the all-time greats, a Neil Young, a Paul Westerberg, a David Bowie. My last couple of books are about David Bowie and the Beatles. And for me, Taylor Swift is in that pantheon. A song like All Too Well, which is on Red, or a song like I Knew You Were Trouble, or a song like Last Kiss on the Speak Now album, or Dear John, which is also on the Speak Now album. These are songs from her early records that, to me, just jumped out as signs that this was a songwriter who was, from the very beginning, aiming to be at the level of the all-time greats and absolutely getting there already before she was old enough to rent a car.
What about the public perception of her musicianship? When did that really shift? Because again, I remember before I had a kid who loved Taylor Swift and had listened to a lot of it and grown to appreciate it, myself and probably many other people like me kind of dismissing her as that, yeah, she writes a great teenage pop song or country song. She's great writing about her feelings and her boyfriends and et cetera, et cetera. She is not mostly perceived as that anymore. And I'm wondering if you can point to musically a time when just the general public stopped, thinking of her as a country pop teen heartthrob, whatever, and started thinking of her as one of the greats.
I think it was the two indie folk albums that you mentioned in 2020 when she made Folklore and then a few months later made Evermore. And those were albums that I think converted whoever was still trying to hold on to the image of her as just a bubblegum teenage pop singer. She was always so much more than that, but because she was young and female and because she had a young teenage girl audience, that's what people saw her as, and that's how people dismissed her.
And then she's doing a duet with Bon Iver.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Then she's, doing this album with, Aaron Dessner from The National. She is someone who had already achieved that level of artistry, but those albums, Folklore and Evermore, those were the ones that made it clear to any skeptics that she was a serious songwriter and that it really was all about the songs. It was not about the pop phenomenon or the hype or anything like that, but that she was writing songs like, you mentioned her Bon Iver duet, Exile, which is a phenomenal song, August, Mirror Ball, Seven. These are, to my mind, some of the greatest songs written in this century.
I mean, I will say as a former skeptic who may have been impressed with her music, but not to my taste or whatever, it was The Last Great American Dynasty where I was like, holy shit, that's an incredibly well-written song, like just from the storytelling of it.
Yeah.
And it all started to kind of click for me. But I want to ask you lastly about the phenomenon of connection with her fans, because this is another thing that at least I don't think I've seen very often before, just like the level of incredible devotion to everything about her, right? From the friendship bracelets to the trying to find all these hidden coded messages in songs to the online army literally ready to decimate anyone. That's why I'm speaking very nicely right now. Where does that fierce connection come from? How has she built that?
It's wild that it comes from, she writes these songs that seem really personal and often very lonely, often songs that are very sad, hitting us in very lonely places. A song like Seven, that song just destroys me. A song like Enchanted, that song just destroys me. And yet she makes these songs sound universal at the same time. So you have that sensation of listening to a song like one of my favorites on Folklore is My Tears Ricochet, which is a very sad, gloomy song sung from beyond the grave to the lover she left behind. And to stand in a stadium with 60,000 people all singing that song is so surreal. And yet she just creates that vibe. The vibe of a Taylor Swift show is so warm and affectionate. It's got the beautiful experience. Just the first time I went to the Eras Tour, I was just walking through the parking lot. I just took the bus to the show and I had just begun to walk through the parking lot when suddenly people I'd never seen before were just giving me friendship bracelets. And that's just kind of the vibe at the show. It's very warm, friendly. It's just a very welcoming community. It reminds me of a Grateful Dead show in a lot of ways. That kind of tribal connection and the way that people just embrace each other and embrace being part of this community. When she just played Dublin this summer and U2 sent her flowers and there was a card from Bono that just said, "Welcome to Dublin, please leave some of it standing." I think that's a good message to Toronto as well. I'm sure they will leave some of it standing.
Amazing. Rob, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Rob Sheffield, the author of Heartbreak is the National Anthem, How Taylor Swift Reinvented Pop Music. And that was the big story. I hope you had fun with us. Hope you like Taylor Swift by now. If you don't, you probably turned this off a long time ago. If you want to take a guess at how many Taylor Swift references I dropped in the intro, please send that number to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. There's no prizes or anything. I'll just pat you on the back in the credits. Speaking of those credits, the lead producer of The Big Story is Joe Fish, Robin Simon, who somehow has never listened to a full Taylor Swift album, is also a producer on this show. Matt Kesselman handles our sound design. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. And Mary Jubrin, who caught every reference in the intro, is our audience development lead. Together, that makes us Frequency Podcast Network, and we are a division of Rogers. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We've got In This Economy tomorrow and a blast from the past on Sunday, and we'll be back with a fresh big story on Monday. We'll talk then.